So this morning we're going to go through how to harvest your flow hive and some tips and tricks to go along with that. If you look at this frame here, you can see that they're just closing in the cappings, which is a beautiful thing to watch and one of the great joys of having observation windows on your hive. And it also gives you an idea of how full the honey is inside the flow hive super. Now if we come to the back of the hive here, so this is the rear door of the hive, and if you've got any questions, put them in the comments below and we'll get to answering them at the end. So if I open this, I can then take off the back door of the hive and I can see that you've got honey in these frames here. Now this is a really interesting and intriguing view. When my father and I were inventing the flow hive, we came across this a little bit by accident, but realised that it was such a great and useful view to see what's going on inside the hive. Now here, this frame we harvested less than a week ago. This time of year, in springtime, they're filling that up quite quickly, but you can see they're not quite full because the honey doesn't come to the edge. The bees are busy reducing that nectar from the flowers down to a moisture content below 20%. They're doing that because they want the honey to then keep in the hive in case they need it later. Now, for us to harvest it, we also want it to keep on the shelf in the jar, so we want that moisture content below 20%. So that honey there isn't quite ready yet. So we want to identify a nice frame to harvest, and how you do that is by choosing one that the bees have put their capping on. If you look closely, you can see these cells are all full right out to the edge, and if you look down in between the frames, you can even see the wax capping they're putting on top of each cell. And if you look closely, you'll even see bees depositing and moving nectar around with their tongues, which is a really quite an interesting view and a great thing to have a cross section of the frames here. So what you're trying to do is ascertain a frame that's nice and full. The end view does usually give you a pretty good idea of what's going on inside the hive. Now sometimes you can get in a situation where the bees get a bit hungry and they'll eat some of the honey away in the middle. The honey around that is usually ready to go still with the moisture content below 20%, so you still get good honey but not as much out of the frame. So looking at these frames here, I think this one's a good one to choose. The safety first, so this hive actually is a bit aggressive. You do get to know your hives. If you're new to beekeeping, wear your protective gear, wear a bee suit, make sure people you are inviting next to your hive also have bee suits or bee veils, depending on how aggressive your hive might be. Now, we're also standing right in the flight path of this hive. Where this is situated isn't ideal. I've got the hive pointing right into a fence, which means these bees are doubling back around me. So I'm going to put my veil on now, just in case one of these bees lands in my hair or if they start showing a little aggression. Okay, next thing is the harvesting shelf. Now, the way we've designed this is these click onto the hive, and that then forms your shelf. Now a little tip here is adjust this so it's nice and firm. You don't want it all sort of floppy like that. You want to have it so when you put the shelf on, and a nice way to do that, a good tip is to angle it and push it into position. Now that's nice and firm, and the door that you've taken off here becomes your shelf. So then we're ready to go. Now, choosing your jar size, you can use any one of these screws, and we've put extra screws here to give you some more variation. Now, this is set up for this size jar, but if you wanted to do little jars for, say, a wedding or something, then you could use this next screw up, and that would be better because the honey would be falling straight into the jar. If you have it too low, then the wind will blow the stream of honey around and it can get quite messy. If you've got any questions, put them in the comments below and we'll get to answering them later. If you're using a big jar like this, now a 2-litre jar, this size, holds a whole frame of honey. So the next thing is to get prepared with what you need. to harvest your honey, you don't want to be suddenly running around looking for jars, because once you turn the tap on for a frame, then you don't want to turn it off again. You want to make sure all the honey comes out, otherwise it'll spill into the hive. So you're committed to continuing to harvest that frame, so make sure you have enough jars. If you put the shelf bracket down lower on this position, then that'll be good for this size jar. So you've got a few options there. Okay, I'm going to put that back on and let's get into it. We've got our shelf ready, we've chosen our frame. We're going to need a key. If you could grab me a key to turn. The key access cover comes out, and then there's a little cap up here. So I'm going to pull that out too. Thank you, Leah. In the top here there's 2 slots, and we want to be in the lower one. But first of all, we want to make sure we set up our jar. The cap comes out here. Put those in the spot where you remember. And there's a little tongue here. Now, that cleans out what we call the leak back point. So sometimes you get honey seeping into this trough area, and that little point there is to allow it to go back for the bees to reuse rather than to build up. You can see a little bit of build up in this one. A little trick when that happens is just to turn the cap around, and what that'll do is break that wax there. Or you can pull it out and you see it's just taking that wax away. If there's still wax present in that little leak back point, you can use a tube to clean it. But that's more of a maintenance thing. Put that one back in. So, a little tongue, give it a bit of a wiggle, push it all the way in, then put your jar underneath. Now, I'm choosing the bottom slot here. Also make sure your hive is level. So, level in the sideways direction. If you have a look here, we've put a level bubble in the flow hive 2, if you've got the flow hive 2, and you can adjust each corner of the hive independently. Around here on the side, there's also a level, which is set up to show you the harvesting angle. Now, when the bubble's in the middle, you're good to go to harvest. That gives you about a 3-degree slope backwards, which is what you need for the honey to drain into the jar. If you don't do that, then you'll get some flooding into your hive if the hive is sloping forwards or it's too flat, so that's really important. Now if I insert that key, next thing is it can be quite hard to turn the frame. Sometimes they really wax and propolize the parts together, and it can be useful just to do it a segment at a time. So if I put the key in and give that a turn, it's nice and easy to turn. But if I was to go all the way, it would be quite firm. Now it seems like it's not too firm, so I could then push it all the way in and turn the whole frame at once, like that. Hold your hand right at the bottom of the key to give you the most leverage, and give it a good turn and the honey will come out. But do it in segments. One thing you can do is harvest just a small amount of honey if you're not sure or you don't want to take too much honey from the hive, just by putting the key in a little way and turning it, and you'll just harvest a portion or maybe a jar full. If you've got any questions, put them in the comments and we'll get to answering them shortly. You can see the honey coming down the tube, which is a beautiful thing. It's just about to drop into the jar. It's a really light amber colour today, which is possibly the wild quince or Goya that we have locally here, which is a really beautiful floral flavour. And one of the joys, I think, is having different flavours all from the one hive. So I would always recommend harvesting single frames to single jars, and reason being is you get people really enjoying all the different flavours, and it's such a joy to be able to share that with your friends and family when they come, and to really appreciate the amazing work the bees do. You can see a different colour here, and that's the frame we harvested a week ago. Quite different colour to this one here, so we'll be expecting quite a different flavour in this frame than this one. Last night I was harvesting a bit of honey with a friend at a hive just outside my door. I just wanted to show you the difference between two of the frames in the hive. Isn't that incredible? You've got almost black honey here and a really light one here. And this one's like dark and malty and quite strong, and this one's got more floral bursts, and it's just amazing to have more than one flavour coming out of your hive. I used to keep bees conventionally and harvest all the honey and mix 30 hives of frames all into one big extractor, and then I'd sell that to the local shops. And now I think, wow, all those flavours I missed out on. I didn't get to really have this and the joy of tasting them both.
Cedar, Andrew is asking, how do you harvest from a classic hive if there's no shelf?
Okay, so if you don't have a shelf, then you can easily make one yourself just by getting something from your house, or some kind of prop, or another bee box. Or we do have the shelves available for classic hives also, if you want to purchase that one from our web store. Isn't that beautiful, just watching it going? I never get sick of watching the honey pour out. It's just an amazing thing. I'm going to have to taste that. Wow, that is a beautiful flavour. Okay, so when you're harvesting to small jars, obviously you're going to need to change the jars, and that can be a fun thing, especially if you're sharing harvesting with friends and family, and you've got to see if you can get no dribbles on the edge of the jar. Almost, but not quite. The other thing it's handy to have around is some kind of covering, whether it be some kitchen wrap or a honeybee wrap, one of those wax wraps, just in case the bees get interested in your honey. When the bees are hungry, they'll be looking out for sources of nectar or sources of honey. Now, if they find the honey at the back of the hive, they'll go back inside, do a dance, and tell the rest of the hive where the honey is. And then you end up with a whole lot of bees in your jar. So if that starts to happen, you want to cover your jar up with something. So it's always good to have that handy. It's another tip.
Stephanie's from Adelaide and has drones up in her super. She has a queen excluder on and is wondering what she should do.
Okay, if you end up with drones in your super, then there's two reasons for that. The most common one being your hive has gone queenless down the bottom, and the workers have started to lay. Now when the workers lay, they can only lay unfertilised eggs, and what that means is you'll end up with a whole lot of drones emerging from your flow cells. Now the other reason you can get drones in the top is if the queen slips through the excluder. Now that can happen when she's small and early in her life. She might just mate and then slip through the excluder, and then you've got the queen in the top. So what you'll need to do then, if you've got the queen in the top, is take out your flow frames, take off the excluder, so you'll be removing this entire box in your bee suit, of course, and gloves, and then brush off all of the bees either to the entrance or down into the brood nest. Better into the brood nest. If the queen is in the top, you'll need to brush them down into the box. Or what you do is you grab the frames and you shake them, and then I typically use a bit of foliage just to brush the bees into your bottom box. Put the excluder back on, put your hive back together with the super on top, and what you'll find is if there was a queen in the top, she's now in the bottom. And then any brood you'll need to wait for 21 days to make sure if there is any worker brood laid in the frames, they've had time to hatch, and then the flow frames will function as normal after that. If your hive, the most common reason of drones up there is the workers have started laying, and that means you've got no queen in the bottom, so you'll need to get in there and fix that situation. Last week we showed you how to fix a queenless hive. Have a look at that video. You can either add a queen from a queen breeder, it's most recommended, or if you don't have access to that, then you can add a frame of brood with eggs on it from another hive into the bottom, and hopefully they'll raise a queen from that. Great questions, keep them coming in.
Bernadette's in Sydney and supered her hive 4 weeks ago. The brood box was really full and healthy, but she can't see any honey yet. Has she done something wrong?
Okay, the brood box is really full and healthy and they haven't added anything into the flow super yet, then patience is the game. Now I'm just going to swap that jar over. Look at that, beautiful. Typically I don't do any intervention, I just put the flow frames on top of a busy hive, wait for the nectar flow to come on, then they get in here and they fill up the frames. Now if you're getting impatient, you want to see some more activity, what you can do is scrape some burr comb, which is basically some wax from the top of this box, and press it into the flow frame surface with your hive tool. Now you won't damage the flow frame surface, it's just a matter of giving the bees some wax. What they'll do is then go, hang on, that's not supposed to be there, and they will chew away that wax, recycle it in that area. So you might like to do it on the edges where you can view through the windows and watch that happen and watch the bees actually recycle that wax, coat the cells and complete the cells, and then the process will start from there.
Donna's wondering, where do we get our jars from and do we sell them?
We don't sell these jars. These are simply purchased online and they come in the mail in a big box. We have a lot of them around. We often wash them out and reuse them, but it is nice to have a source of jars that you can give honey away in, and it is nice to collect jars from your kitchen, take the labels off, make them look good so that you can use them as giveaways, which is one of the many joys of beekeeping.
Catherine's wondering if the dark honey tastes more like treacle or golden syrup.
It does, you know, the dark honey is so malty. There's a few flavours of dark honey that we get here, and one is almost like a licorice, and the other is really quite malty, as you say. And they're both a really dark red colour, so dark that even in a small jar you can hardly see light through it. It's really quite cool.
Marianne is asking what actually happens when you open the flow frames.
Whoops.
Nice catch.
That's a great question. Now, for years we tried all sorts of different ways to get honey out of hives without opening it. The aim of the game was to find a gentle, easy way to harvest honey from the hive while the bees were just going about their business. So we experimented with all sorts of ways to achieve that, many fails. The way we came to, and it's surprising how well it actually works, is if you imagine the cells as hexagon cells like this, and the bees are going in here depositing their nectar, we give them a partly formed cell with gaps between, and the reason why we put gaps between is so that they bridge it with their wax, and if a bee happens to be down a cell, if you've harvested a bit early, then the bees don't get caught between these moving parts. There's a gap between of wax. So what happens then, we come from the outside of the hive and we turn the key, as you've seen, and each cell divides in half like that. Honey then flows down that zigzag path that's been created into the trough at the bottom and out. And it's surprisingly simple, but it's amazing the effect it has of being able to harvest honey in a completely new way.
Leanne's asking why one honey can be darker than the other.
So that's because there's different sources of nectar. There's as many variations of honey in flavour and colour as there are nectar producing flowers in the world. So this honey, I can't I thought it was going to be their wild quince or Goya, but it's not. It's something else floral. I suspect it's this eucalypt over here that's been flowering recently. Now, the eucalypt honeys are a beautiful, beautiful honey, and each different honey has different properties. You find all sorts of interesting ones. That the bloodwoods around here have this interesting property where if you touch it and you move your hand over here, you get this big string still connecting from here to here, and that's one way you can tell that that's the bloodwood. The leptosperms, or the medicinal tea trees that are being marketed now, have some of them have interesting properties of jelly-like structures, and you'll see the globules coming out when that's present around. You see these globules coming out, and so yeah, there's all these different flavours, and it all depends on the flowers.
Peter Cox, who's our South Australian ambassador, is asking, do you have any tips on how to stop the wind from blowing the honey away from the honey running into the jar? In South Australia we get really strong winds, so he generally uses a harvesting bucket, but that doesn't isolate the flavours. Okay,
so what you can do is position your jar so it's right up here, and you can cover it if necessary with some kitchen wrap or one of those wax wraps. Now, that will stop the wind and also stop any bees finding your honey. If you're going to do that, you're better off using a larger jar, because it's a bit annoying to have to change so many small jars in that case. So you'd run the shelf lower, get a big jar like this, and cover it up so the wind's not blowing it around. These 2 litre jars that you can buy in health food stores are about perfect for that shelf position just above the ventilated area down here. Now, that'll be right up against it, easy to cover. Some people do get some plumbing parts and put elbows through lids of jars. You can do that as well. Whatever you need to do in order to make it easy for you to harvest. Good question, Peter.
Diane would like to know, do you always judge whether a flow frame is ready to harvest by looking in the window? Is there ever a need to inspect the flow frames to see if they are full?
As you get to know beekeeping and as you get to know the flow frames and how they behave, what you're trying to do is build up a bit of a repertoire of what this means and what's happening in the hive. So when you look at this and you look at the side windows, if you have a look here at this side window, you'll notice that the bees are just closing in the cappings. You see nectar all through this area, and they're just closing in the cappings. So as an experienced beekeeper, I can tell there's a honey flow on just by looking at that. Now, if there was a whole lot of empty cells and they're starting to get checkered, where there's a missing cell here and a missing cell here, and it's all empty all the way down, that means they're getting a little hungry. Now, if they're getting a little hungry, they also may eat some of the honey out from the centre of the frame. So the view that you're looking at here might not tell the whole story. You might see full honey, nicely capped on the end, but it's not full all the way across the frame. But if there's a flow on, and you can see by the side window, and you can see by the pattern here, that this is a filling pattern. If it was full cell, empty cell, full cell, empty cell down here, I'd say that would be when the bees are getting hungry. But if you can see that there's a flow on, and you can see that it's full here, then generally it's full all the way through. Having said that, beekeepers who keep hives conventionally will usually take frames if they're 70% capped, and the moisture content will still be low enough to keep on the shelf. You can buy a thing called a refractometer, which you can tell the moisture content. So if you have harvested a little bit early and you're worried it's a bit runny in the jar, then you might want to check that. Worst case scenario is you have to eat it quickly, no problem in my household, or it will ferment on the shelf and turn into mead, which is the next case. Not a bad thing either if you if you like making mead.
That flows into the next question. Ellen says, what is fermented honey and why does it happen?
So fermented honey is when the natural occurring yeasts in the honey can have enough water available to start the process of eating those sugars and converting it into alcohol and CO2. Now, that's the process of fermentation that wines and mead and things those yeasts eat sugars. Now, if the sugar content is high and there's only a water content of under 20%, then those yeasts can't do their thing and start consuming the sugars. So it's all a balance between the yeasts in the honey that are naturally occurring and the sugar content, water content balance. Great, more questions.
Tim's looking at getting into beekeeping and is wondering, where do you get bees from and how much should you expect to pay?
Okay, great question. So there's three main ways to get bees. Easiest one is buy a nucleus off a bee breeder. So get online, have a look around, get on the phone, ask who has nucleuses for sale. Springtime is the easiest time to get that, and what that is a little starter hive with 4 or 5 frames in it, a queen laying, honey stores, pollen stores, everything they need. All you need to do is give them a bigger box, look after them, and they'll grow. And once they've filled out the bottom box, you can then put the honey super on top. We've got a video showing you how to do that. The next way would be to take a split. If you've got a friend with a hive, or if you've got another hive already, then when the bees are busy and there's lots of bees in the hive, you open the windows, it's nice and crowded, then that's a good time to take a split. In fact, it's beneficial to take a split from the hive to limit that hive from swarming. When they swarm, half the bees go and it takes them a while to recover, and if you're in a suburban area, the swarm may land in your neighbour's on your neighbour's balcony post, and it could cause some neighbourly tension. So the idea is to split your hives when they build up, typically in the springtime. So you might be lucky enough to take a split. We've got videos to show you how to do that. If you dial back a couple in our Facebook live feed, you'll find us taking a split between these 2 hives here. Now, it's a process of moving some of the frames from the bottom to your new hive, and they can then raise a queen from there, provided they've got eggs on those frames. The next way is to catch a swarm. Now, if you catch a swarm, it's a fun thing to do. We've got videos to show you how to do that, a little more adventurous and a little more potluck. If you want to catch a swarm, then go to where there's a lot of existing hives, and you might be lucky to find a swarm hanging on a tree branch and be able to shake it into a box. You can also get on lists of alerts if there's a swarm in an area that you can then go and catch. Now, there is a 4th way, and that's called a bait hive, where you basically set up a box like this and you put a scent in there that the bees want to, are more likely to be attracted to. So that's typically a lemongrass in a little Ziploc bag, lemongrass oil, a little pinhole for it to leak out, or you can buy what's called Swarm Commander, which is a little little spray bottle. Now, or you can get some old brood frames and put them in a box. That will also attract bees. But if you put a couple of hives around, so we've got a few swarm catchers around here just in case the hives swarm and we're not here on a weekend, the scout bees may find those bait hives, move in and start the colony from there. You have to be a bit lucky for that to happen. I've got 40 or so hives at my place, and I've had a couple of successful bait hive catches over the years.
Patrick has a flow hive too and is wondering, is it possible to add a second flow super on top of that?
It certainly is. You can add a second flow super on top. If you swing the camera that way, you'll see there's a hive up there with a double super, and that's something you can do if you want to add another flow super. Some people, especially in the colder regions, like to give the bees a bit more space. Now you can add a second brood box or a second super to give the bees more space. What that means is the colony can get to a bigger size store a bit more honey for the long winter to come. Around here, I prefer to keep them in this configuration. They're easier to manage, and it just means that you do need to take a split in springtime when they build up, but that's fantastic. There's always people looking for bees, and you can then take a split from a percentage of your hives and create more colonies.
Stephen is asking, when you harvest from the flow frame, do you need to wait till the column is full, or is it okay to harvest with 1 or 2 cells not full?
1 or 2 cells not full is fine. What you're trying to do is get a bit of an average across the frame. You want it mostly capped, at least 70% capped. When I say capping, that's the wax the bees put over to say the honey is below 10% about in moisture content. Honey is ready. There'll often be 1 or 2 cells missing like that, and that's fine. What you don't want is the entire row not to be full like this, because that shows there's a whole lot of cells on the frame that are nowhere near ready. They're not out to the edge. But when you get a few patchy ones, that's fine. You'll often get the edge frame with a few missing along here. But if you put that visual up against the side, you'll actually see that this frame is capped all the way across the edge. So sometimes you will get in a situation where the outer frame, they might not cap it on the end, the outside. Basically, it's the very corner of the beehive. Bees fill from the middle out towards the extremities, so that's kind of the last places they will fill. So I'll often be harvesting an edge frame because I can see it's capped all the way across, even if I can't see it's full here. Another good tip is, if you're harvesting for the first time, then harvest 1, 2 or 3 frames first. Make sure your setup is good, make sure the slope's right, make sure you're not getting big honey spills. If you get a whole lot of spillage of honey, then get in contact with us. We might be able to help you work out what's going wrong in your setup. It's normal to have a little bit of a spill. Even in conventional harvesting, you're usually taking lids off and breaking a whole lot of comb and you get spills inside the hive. It's not a new thing for bees. The flow hive too has a nice big tray in the bottom to catch any spills that do happen while you're harvesting, so they don't dribble to the outside of the hive. But yeah, normal to have a little bit. If you're getting litres down there, get in contact. We might be able to help you with your setup so that you can get it right. We have had situations where even our staff who are trained have said, my hive's had this big spill, what's going on? And when we've come back with a level and measured it, slowly the front of the hive has sunken and they haven't noticed, and the slope was wrong. And so things like that can cause honey to spill inside the hive also.
So you've almost answered Kayla's question. Why does the honey drip throughout the hive down to the vent at the bottom? Does this kill the bees? As I noticed, they all gather outside and are covered in honey.
Okay. So if you've harvested a whole lot of frame, sometimes the way they've capped it, if they've got sort of indented caps down the bottom and bulged out at the top, seems to be the recipe where when the moving parts happen, you get some honey flowing down the frame. Now, if you add it up, it's only a small percentage of the honey in here. Bees are used to, I guess, a lifetime of humans opening the hive and breaking apart comb and spills inside the hive and cleaning it up. What you find is, even if there's no spills and you harvest, you'll still get bees collecting at the front afterwards. That's if you harvest a lot of frames. We're not seeing it now because it's only 1 frame, but if you go ahead and harvest 4 or 5 frames out of there, then you'll usually see a collection of bees at the front. Now, there's a few reasons for that. One is they need space, and if they're a crowded hive, they need space to start reworking the comb. They can't do it if they're all jam-packed in there. The other one is ventilation. When you harvest and you've got honey inside the hive, then it changes the humidity in the hive, and the bees need to allow space so they can start ventilating the hive in order to get the humidity right and allow space to rework the frames.
Stephen just received his new nucleus and it had chalk brood in it. He was advised to put sliced ripe banana in to trick them to stimulate into throwing out the carcasses. It seemed to work. Have you heard of this?
I have heard of that, and I haven't tried it myself, although I'd certainly know beekeepers who swear by it. And it's one of these hot, sort of debated topics online of whether the chalk brood was going to disappear anyway, or whether that helped. And the theory behind it, the smell in the banana skins sets off a bit of an alarm in the hive, and they want a clean shop, they want to clean everything out, and that helps them clean out those chalk brood, which is like dead larvae in the cells that have turned into little chalky mummies. Now, it's not it's usually repairable by two things. One is replacing the queen. The next queen might come with genetics that is more hygienic and move that chalk brood out. But the other one is just some time. As the colony gets stronger, they might clean out those frames. But if you want to keep an eye on it, because you don't want a whole lot of chalk brood or letting off its pathogens in the hive either. But yeah, by all means try it and see how you go, and join in the online topics debating on whether it works or not.
Ralph would like to know, what's the yield per flow frame? His has dropped this year despite being full.
So the average yield per flow frame is about
Jar?
up to 3 kilograms. Now we need another jar. If you grab one from the box over there, this frame's going well. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and it's still going. Now, so that's moving up to the 3 litre range with the size of these jars. That's about what it depends how well they cap it, and it also depends whether the bees have eaten out a section in the middle. So it's wonderful the amount of honey you get out of one frame. So if you consider that's 7 jars already, there's 42 jars worth of honey in these frames when they're full, and a hive like this in peak season can fill it up in a couple of weeks again. But then you might get 6 months with not much at all. So like any kind of farming, it's got its season and it's weather dependent, and you get amazing harvests, and you also get times where there's not much.
Wesley's asking, what do you do if the queen dies before a new queen cell hatches?
Okay, so if a queen dies in the hive, most of the time the bees will get it together to raise a new one. In fact, the bees will bump off an old queen if she's not performing well enough. And so it's a relatively normal thing for the hive to requeen itself. Sometimes you get into a situation where that requeening is unsuccessful. Now, last week we covered how to fix a queenless hive. And what happened is a split we had taken, and we showed you how to do that split live. It had a really good chance of doing well, but for whatever reason we didn't end up with a laying queen. At one point there was a queen because we were in there and we took some video of it, but for whatever reason that queen didn't progress to being a good laying queen. Now what you need to do then, if you've got a hive that's what we call hopelessly queenless, that's where they don't have a queen, they don't have the resources to make one. What's going to happen is the workers will start laying eggs eventually, but they can only lay unfertilised ones, which means they can only lay males, and in the hive you'll end up with a whole lot of drones who don't collect nectar or pollen, don't do any chores around the hive, and the whole thing ends up being dysfunctional and dying out, just like most male out. No. We won't go there. Yep.
Donna Lynn's asking, when you register with Biosecurity or DPI, where do you put the registered numbers for your hive?
Okay, great question. So it's important to register with the DPI here in Australia, and many other countries have a registration process. The small amount of funds that it does take for your registration goes towards developing a program to keep bees healthy in our country. So it's really important to do so. Also helps the DPI know where hives are and how many they are. So it is a requirement of beekeeping to register your hives here in Australia. Now the numbers you can write on your hive, you want to write it on each box and also on top of your frames. And it's just a little number, you can write it with a texter, pencil, whatever you want, but it is a requirement to put your number on the hive. We usually just put them down in the corner. You can see on this white hive over here the texter mark there, and it's just a simple little registration number.
Jeanette is saying it seems that the honey drains quite completely from the flow hive. Over the cold winters, is some honey left for the bees to live on?
That's a great question. One of the advantages of the flow hive is you can just take a little bit of honey if you want to. In a conventional way, typically people take the lot while they're in there because it's such an effort to go through that extraction process. You wouldn't take a single frame out and go through a centrifuging or process doing it in that conventional way. So you can, if you're concerned that there's not enough honey for perhaps a long winter to come, just take a little bit for your family and leave the rest for the bees. You can even take just part of a frame if you're curious about what the flavour's like, but it is important if you live in a cold area or anywhere that has a really long time with no flowers to make sure they have enough honey to survive, because the honey is their food, it's their carbohydrate source, and the pollen stores, which are down in the bottom box here, are their protein source, and they need to survive and have a balanced diet to be healthy.
Dallas would like to know what's the best way to clean out the bottom of the flow frames without removing them.
Okay, so if you've got a bunch of muck building up in the bottom of the flow frame, that's this area here. This hive happens to be fairly clean, so we don't need to do it here. But sometimes you get a bunch of honey dripping into that area, and it could get fermented if it's left there and you haven't cleared that leak back point. And there's a few ways to go about cleaning it that I've tried. Mostly I hardly have to do anything, but one is you can get a hose and just spray it into this area and let the water flow out. You can put your tube in like this and spray it up there so that point is blocked. Just fill it and let it wash, fill it and let it wash. Honey does clean up well with water. If there's still muck there, you can get your flow key and wrap something around the end, like I was going to say a sock, but you want to make sure it's a clean one, and put it in this area here and just give it a wipe. So that'll clean that trough area prior to harvest.
Mary Ellen has the classic flow hive in cedar. They're 4 years old and both boxes have cracks in the wood. Will the bees seal with propolis, or does she need to replace the boxes in spring? She's in New York and they have really tough winters.
Okay, so unsure how bad the cracking is. So wood outdoors is always a bit of a naturally wanting to degrade and will need maintenance over time. So one thing you could do is give it a paint and make sure you get plenty of paint into any cracks that are formed in the wood, and that'll help stick it all together. Beekeepers who really look after their equipment can make a wooden box last for 20 years. Cedar happens to be highly durable. You could even get it a lot longer if you make sure you give it a coat every now and then of your favourite sealant. If you want to keep it looking wood like this, then you'll need to hit it with a bit of sandpaper. After a few years it might not be looking too flash anymore, and then give it another coat. If you're wanting to do paint, then a good outdoor house paint will really preserve it for quite a long time.
How many more questions would you like?
Okay, we've got lots and lots more questions. We've got time for another couple of questions. Thank you for so many great questions. Keep putting them in the comments. Answer them offline once we've finished this call.
Hayden's dad has anaphylaxis to bees. Is it okay for him to still have dinner on his back porch without being stung? The hive is roughly 20 metres away.
Okay. If you're new to beekeeping or not even new to beekeeping, it's a great idea to read our safety information. We have links on the bottom of our website pages, and in terms of anaphylaxis is a very serious issue and needs to be treated with care, and you should take the advice of trained first aid people in that situation. Having hives around does increase the risk of bee stings. Of course, you can get stung without hives around as well. Many of us remember getting stung as a kid just by walking across the clover. But yeah, anaphylaxis is a serious thing. There's first aid information on there, stuff about EpiPens and so on, which is important information to read.
Glyn would like to know, is the flow hive okay for native bees?
The answer is only if you're in Europe, because these bees, Apis mellifera, are a European honeybee. There's also another species, the Japanese honeybee or Asian honeybee, or it's one of the Asian honeybees, which can also be kept in flow hives, and that's native to that area. Here in Australia, it's not our native bee. If you try to put our native bees, which are tiny little black ones, the ones that actually form colonies and produce a little bit of honey, then they don't use cells anything like this size. They form more grape-like pollux in a spiral structure inside a very small enclosure, and you can harvest about 1/2 kilo from them a year. So they're quite low honey producing. You wouldn't bother with an invention like this for such a small amount of honey.
Stephen says, whilst obsessively observing my new hive, I've seen some bees resting outside with their abdomens having a pumping type action. What are they doing?
So there's quite a few different things, and it's really interesting to observe the entrance. Always keep safety in mind. That's the pointy end of the hive where the guards are. Now, if they've got their abdomen or their tail they're raised at the back and they're fanning, then what they're doing is fanning their Nasonoff gland. The Nasonoff gland is where they're producing a scent to say, hey, this is our home, this is where we are. So it helps the bees, the new bees that are taking their orientation flights, know where home is. Now, there could be other reasons. If they're pumping like that, they could be sucking up a little bit of nectar. You'll see that action when they're doing that, but it's a perfectly normal thing to witness at the entrance. What I'm going to do now is close up the flow frame. Now that is an important thing to do, and it's how you finish the harvesting process. So you'll notice that the honey has now drained to a trickle. I could wait here and potentially fill this 8th jar, but I don't think I'll stay around that long. And so what I'm going to do is just insert the little cap in the bottom and leave the remaining bit to dribble back into the hive for the bees to recycle. So I simply pulled out that cap. Now I've got this. You can either eat the remaining honey in there, or you can rest it on your jar like that to go back into the jar. Now the next thing you're going to need to do is put the key in the upper position. If you try and put the cap back, we've put a little tag on it to remind you that it won't quite go in, and that means you haven't reset your frame. We did that because as we were inventing the flow hive, we kept forgetting to reset the frame into the position that the bees can use it to store honey again. So what you do is simply insert this into the top, push it all the way till you feel a knock at the back, and that means when you turn this key like that, all of those frame parts are now moving back into the position, the bees can re-wax them up, reform the cells, draw their comb out further, fill it with nectar, and reduce that water content down to below 20%, put their capping on, and the whole process starts again. There's been a few questions coming in about our Paulownia hive. We do have a special on that at the moment. If you see behind me here, this is the wood we're talking about. It's a very lightweight wood that has quite good insulating properties actually, and also quite good resistance to outdoor rot and so on. So that's the reason why we've chosen this wood type, and we have a special on that at the moment. It's a brand new thing for us here, but I have been testing the Paulownia wood in my apiary for some years now, about 3 years. So if you are interested, then jump online and have a look at that. And if you've got any questions, put them in the comments below and we'll get to answering them. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've learned something about how to harvest and some tips and tricks, and tune in again next week and we'll be going through pulling a hive apart and showing you about what's happening on the inside and teaching beekeeping, because in the end we want everybody to be successful beekeepers and to be able to enjoy the many joys of beekeeping, watching the bees do their thing, watching them build their comb, and watching them bring in the beautiful nectar and turn it into all of the different flavours of the seasons for you, your friends and family to enjoy. Thanks for watching.